You both have so much experience just trying to figure out what people want and how they will vote. What's your reaction to what we have heard so far today?
Want to go first?
Well, I thought that to pull together some of the strings of what we heard, there's a sense clearly that people want to invest in kids and families as almost for its own sake, but because there's a common ground there as well. But one of the things that clearly we need to do, as we've heard, is that kids don't have the strength of political voice that they need to have, and I think that becomes the obligation of this room. I think there's some other pieces in this that become very important. One of the things we found in our anti-hunger work at Share Our Strength is that people get very excited about a problem that they believe is a solvable problem. There's so many issues that we all care about, and if you've got to triage in a sense of like, how do I actually get something done? We often listen to the voice of Jonathan Kozol, who's worked on a set of these issues that we're talking about for longer than most of us, and he said you should pick battles that are big enough to matter but small enough to win. And so if you think about childhood hunger, which came very high on, I think, question number 3 in our book about, where would you like to see more investment, and 56% said childhood hunger. I think because people realize that that is a solvable problem. No shortage of food in this country, no shortage of food programs, something that we can actually come together on, and these programs were created with bipartisan support.
David, obviously you've worked very closely with the Obamas, and one of the things that struck me is that, up and down the ladder, across the aisle, people think politicians are failing our children and that we don't have a better future ahead. How do we manage through that?
Yeah, it is a phenomenon that's been fairly consistent, although the intensity now is accelerated. And over the course of a good 10-year period, I had the joy of listening to voters in hundreds upon hundreds of focus groups. And essentially, there were types of messages that elected officials and advocates could deliver around kids and families that immediately got you out of, in some instances, a justified, cynical mindset into some opening. So imagine a world where you're not beginning simply with an assessment of this is a policy that's going to make life better for you. Because the reaction is, A, who are you? Why should I trust you to have my family's best interests at heart? Are you reflecting the views of different families and different perspectives? And so you begin with, especially in politics, with this reaction to, I'm not buying what you're selling as the default mode. The truly gifted and important, in some ways, elected officials across the political spectrum begin with statements that validate what every parent wants to hear and what even kids want to hear. There is no one who cares more about your child than you. That has to be the anchor for any type of communication. Because once you do that, if you are a Republican parent or a kid or a Democratic parent or a kid, that is the most foundational piece of common ground. You are beginning from a place of emotion and, frankly, love, rather than immediately getting into a policy discussion that inevitably will take you into blue versus red, left versus right. So beginning there begins to give you the path forward, I think.
Billy, you've worked really hard to raise awareness about an issue that I would think everybody can get behind: ending hunger, increasing economic mobility. What have you learned in your work about how we can find common ground?
Well, again, I think emphasizing that this is a solvable problem, that we have the resources. I think people gravitate to that. I think there's an obligation on our part to be bipartisan has become a dirty word in a lot of quarters. I actually had somebody on our staff say to me, when I hear you say bipartisan, I hear something different than I heard 10 years ago. And I said, well, what do you hear? She said, I hear that you're willing to jump in bed with a bunch of racists and do whatever you have to do to keep Mitch McConnell happy. And I was shocked. I mean, I was really stunned, but that was a wake-up call for me because younger people hear it, in a cancel culture world, they hear it differently. But in a world where there's only 50 Senate votes or sometimes 51, if you're not going to be bipartisan, you're not going to get much done. But I think the other thing that attracts support is being willing to be accountable to specific results. I work in a community where everybody points the finger at somebody else. Everybody says, oh, we did our part, but the states didn't do theirs, or the nonprofits didn't do theirs. And so the buck has to stop somewhere, and to be an organization or a community or a movement that says, we're going to be responsible for ending childhood hunger. Whatever the barriers are, we will knock them down. That makes a big difference to people.
The media also plays a huge role in this, and I think many people would agree. You can't turn on a major, and I'm a member of the media, maybe I'll get in trouble for saying this, you can't turn on a major media outlet without feeling the politics hit
Yes.
you. And then there's obviously TikTok, there's YouTube. How do we cut through the noise of all of that? When it is everywhere, and especially for our young people.
Yeah, you don't cut through it. You adapt to the new reality that we live in. I'm going to approximate essentially what I'm seeing in the data in terms of media consumption. If you are talking to individuals under the age of 25, and you are not communicating on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, or Snapchat, you are not communicating with them. You can bemoan the fact that, well, there are all these different media outlets, but essentially when you then begin to see the amount of time that's spent, even among young voters, 18 to 22 years of age, number one platform for any type of consumption is TikTok, 73% of them. 23 to 28, it drops down to 53% on TikTok. 29 to 34, it drops down to 33%. But now you begin to go younger than 18, and you see those numbers simply at the level that they are. So first, the media disaggregation is a reality that everyone needs to adopt and think about. The second thing is that our assumptions, my assumptions about who young voters are, let me just give you some data that I have seen. And it was a beautiful piece, a chart in the Financial Times over the weekend. Young women have never been more liberal, more progressive. And this is across, they had South Korea, they had Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States. By contrast, young men are identifying as conservative at higher numbers than you have seen since the 1980s. And this isn't just in the United States, it's globally. And so there's this amazing divergence that's occurring. So even when you begin to think about, here are the platforms that I need to go into, we all need to question our assumptions about the ideology, worldview, issue salience, the difference between a non-college young person. And even if you think about from a voting perspective, 2/3 to 70% are non-college. So if you are anchoring your beliefs around college-educated, regardless of where, young people, that is a fundamentally different universe of people, perspectives, and worldviews than non-college. And so messaging isn't just the words and the reaction to polls, it's the distribution, but also then a complete assessment without preconditioned views of literally what the universe looks like.
Billy, what's your reaction to that?
Well, when I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking about my 18-year-old son who's a college freshman, and he's registered to vote. He's super well, engaged in the world. There's nothing I've ever been able to tell him that he hasn't seen on TikTok first. I'll see some news event, some development, and I'll share it with him. I was like, yeah,
You're late, Dad. Yeah.
It's there. I just want to come back to this issue of voice for 1 minute, because I think it's going to be such an important responsibility of all of ours. I think there's a perception, and I say this because in addition to all of the new things that we're all advocating for, there are a number of programs and policies already in this place in this country that just don't get utilized because there are so many barriers, bureaucratic and political. So if you take, again, I'm familiar with the school meals program. The school breakfast program 22 million kids in the country get a free school lunch. They're all eligible for breakfast. Only 9 million were getting it until we got involved in this, and we added 3 million. In the summertime, when the schools are closed, only 3 million were getting it. I was in a meeting with Marian Wright Edelman, who was, in our opening video, and she said, the most important thing we can do is kind of bring to fruition the battles we've already won. And so when you think about, as a society, we create these benefits, we create incentives. We do this as a matter of course. Sometimes they're tax breaks, sometimes they're subsidies. Do you think that when we create a benefit for Pfizer or Goldman Sachs or Exxon, that they need to bring a lot of nonprofits together in San Francisco to make sure that they get their benefit? No, they go get it. But it's just the opposite in our world. Congress just passed a $29 billion appropriation for summer meals for the next 10 years. It won't reach a single child or family unless community organizations make sure that state agencies have what they need to eradicate those barriers. So there's a lot of work to do on really good programs that are already out there, and I think that's another way of building common ground.
David, you were Deputy Chief of Staff in the Obama administration, Director of Opinion Research for his 2012 election campaign, and then obviously you went on to work for the foundation. What sticks with you about how to run a successful campaign, and will our candidates this year be able to adapt to all of the issues that you've already laid out?
Yeah, the common element, obviously in political campaigns, in some ways it's easier. The objective is 50+1, and everything flows from that and into that, for good and bad. Because in some ways, then the choices that you're making can get you to 50+1, but the scar tissue that's left afterwards in terms of governing.
What scar tissue are you talking about?
That is a tough business that I've seen. So let me just approach it this way. One of the most amazing things that I saw about the delivery of any message, and I'm going to speak now for the way David Axelrod and President Obama would approach it. There would be times when something would poll very well, or there was an ad that looked really great. And Axelrod would say, I don't care how that tests, we can't run that. Why? It's like, because that's not who he is. And people will see immediately whether or not there is this lack of authenticity that flows from what they are seeing and what the perceptions are. And so when I see the data that both Celinda and Kristen shared about reactions to politicians, this is the scar tissue in some ways that I'm talking about. All I hear are, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, they're horrible, they're great, they're worse, they're whatever. And while we march towards 50+1, and it's important to do that, what happens the day after? And so to be able to both develop messages and from an advocacy perspective, especially around children and families, to make sure that we are using not just the voices, as Billy pointed out, of kids who have a vested interest, but moms and dads who care deeply about their children, and then messengers who, when people see them and hear them, aren't automatically going to say, there's something else here. They want to vote, they're looking for money, or something that cuts across the truth of what you're trying to convey. In an era of profound cynicism, the way you deliver the message, the person that delivers the message, has a great, let me give you an example. I've seen some ad testing going into 2024 on both sides. The very produced 30-second spot, those always do well. The 30-second piece of a normal person on TikTok
Right, I was going to say.
talking about their life is exponentially more powerful. And when you listen to voters, they're like, well, one is BS, and the other is truth, even if I don't agree with it. And so this is the other side, perhaps the good opportunity around social media, is that if done correctly, you can break out of the canned, produced, into something that's a little bit more authentic. Okay.
You know, something else, I feel like there's just an extreme level of fatigue and exhaustion around this, and I just wonder, how do we get people excited again, to engage again
Well, you
in
know, I
this
think that
election?
relates to a point that you were making, David, about cynicism, and for me, it relates to where we focus our energies. So, you know, at the state and local level, there's such a completely different dynamic. Anytime I go to a member of the House or Senate and ask them if they're going to be for something that we're for, they've got to go check with, you know, Mitch McConnell or Chuck Schumer or, you know, whoever, and because they've got to be in lockstep. You go talk to governors and mayors and others, regardless of their party, they will listen. They're not trying to hang on to the majority. That, to me, is where a lot of the cynicism at the federal level comes from. And any member of Congress will tell you that they know a senator or a member of the House is for something, but they can't say it out loud because their party's taken a different position. When you work at the state and local level, you find people actually judging issues on the merits. They may be liberal, they may be conservative, but they're looking at on the merits, and that same cynicism doesn't exist. And that's where all of the programs that we all care about are actually executed in the first place. So that's a place that deserves a lot of attention.
100%.
You know, I'll put that question to you, David, as well, because, you know, it just seems like we want people, we're all here because we want to raise awareness about these issues. And how do we get people to care about these issues when everyone is so tired and exhausted by, you know, the constant cycle and the way things have been going?
Yeah. They're tired and exhausted, but on the flip side, turnout in the past 3 elections has been amazing.
That's some good news.
Across the board, regardless of demographics or party affiliation, people have been voting. A lot of times it's voting against or a reaction to something, but the fact that people care enough across the spectrum to say, I am going to do this, is look, I'm the son of 2 immigrants who came to the United States whose besides the birth of their children, I hope, the proudest moment was when they became United States citizens. Right? That you can't take that for granted. And so, yeah, there's a lot of reason to be upset and frustrated, but, you know, there's a thing about political leaders. I've heard some reference to them as political entrepreneurs. Political entrepreneurs adapt to the market. Once it reaches a point where they see that there is an exhaustion and fed up with a certain way of doing it, some group of people will adapt. And I think it's on all of us, regardless of what you believe and who you support, to be part of that, which is pretty exciting.
All right, I'm going to ask you both what I asked Kristen and Celinda at the end. I'm not going to let you get away with absolutely not. But any predictions for the next 10 months?
You're the expert on this. Go ahead.
Please, give us something.
There are so many variables at play, and the country is so evenly divided. My prediction is probably by midnight on election night, you will not know.
Oh,
but,
no.
But, you know, I want to add I want to reframe your question just one other way, because I think it's important for all of us to realize that social change is more than politics.
Yes, it is.
And we're all political creatures in here, and so our conversation necessarily focuses on politics. Social change is more than that. There's a lot of people who are not political, who have skills, talents, strengths that we need to bring into these processes.
Pick the battles you can win, right?
Yep.
All right. Thank you both.